The river lay still under the pale autumn sky, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a drifting leaf. Ethan Miller stood on the bank, a heavy magnet tied to the end of a coarse rope in his hands. The hobby was new to him, something he had stumbled across online. Magnet fishing, they called it. Most people pulled up old nails, rusted tools, or the occasional worthless piece of scrap. Ethan didn't expect much more than that, but he liked the simplicity of it. Casting the line, dragging it back, feeling for the weight of something hidden below. It gave his restless hands a purpose. On that particular Saturday in 2019, the air carried the crisp bite of October, and the town behind him was as quiet as always. The kind of place where the loudest noise was a distant train horn or the creak of an old sign over the diner on Main Street. Ethan's life felt just as still. At 27, he was stuck working in his uncle's garage, fixing cars that barely paid the bills. His girlfriend had left a month earlier, fed up with his lack of direction. Every day seemed predictable, heavy with repetition. But as he pulled his magnet from the murky water that morning, something unexpected clinked against the steel. At first he thought it was just another scrap of metal, but when he wiped away the rust with the edge of his shirt, a faint shape appeared. It was a badge, an old laminated ID card sealed in metal casing, the kind truckers used to wear on company lots. The photo, though faded, still carried the tired smile of a man. The name stamped below it read, Jack Turner. Ethan stared at it for a long moment, the sound of the river rushing softly in his ears. He didn't recognize the name, but the badge had the weight of something more than junk. It felt like a piece of someone's story, buried for decades and now pushed back into the light. His curiosity stirred, and with it came the first flicker of purpose he had felt in weeks. Before we dive deeper into this journey, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the unfolding of this extraordinary story that begins with a simple cast into the water. Later that afternoon, Ethan carried the badge to the diner, where he often grabbed coffee. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the familiar scent of fried food and strong coffee wrapped around him. Old photographs lined the walls, snapshots of truckers and locals from years gone by. He slid into a booth, turning the badge over in his hands. "What you got there, Ethan?" asked Marlene, the waitress who had worked the counter longer than most people in town had been alive. She leaned on the table, her pen hovering over her order pad. "Found it down by the river," he said. "Looks like some kind of ID. Belonged to a truck driver, I think. Name's Jack Turner." Marlene's expression shifted, the easy smile slipping into something more thoughtful. "Jack Turner. Lord, I haven't heard that name in years." She lowered her voice. "He was the fella who disappeared back in '89. Just up and vanished one night on his route. Folks talked about it for a while, then, well, you know how time works. People forget." Ethan felt the words sink in. A missing man. 30 years gone, his story buried under layers of silence. He looked down at the badge again, now heavier in his hand. "You're sure?" he asked. "As sure as I am standing here," Marlene said, straightening her apron. The sheriff back then looked into it, but nothing ever came of it. Poor man's family never got answers. Ethan left the diner with his coffee, and the badge tucked safely in his jacket pocket. The town street stretched empty before him, lined with old storefronts and houses that seemed unchanged by the decades. Yet the weight of what he carried made everything feel different, sharper, charged with hidden history. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a pull stronger than curiosity. This wasn't just a relic, it was a question begging to be answered. And Ethan Miller, the man who had been drifting through his own life without direction, was about to find himself chasing the truth behind a stranger's disappearance. The badge burned against his chest, as though daring him to take the first step into a story that had waited 30 years to be told. The badge sat on Ethan's nightstand like a challenge. The following morning, sunlight slipped through the blinds, falling across the photograph of Jack Turner's tired smile. Ethan had tossed and turned all night, unable to shake the feeling that this piece of metal and faded ink had found him for a reason. He wasn't a man prone to chasing mysteries. His life had been built on routine, greasy engines, and the monotony of a small-town garage. Yet now he felt the stirrings of something bigger than himself. At the garage, he tried to lose himself in work. The smell of oil and gasoline clung to the air as he tightened bolts beneath the hood of a battered pickup. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the river. Who had Jack Turner been? What had happened in 1989 that left his badge sinking into the mud while his story faded into rumor? His best friend Tyler leaned against the doorway, sipping from a soda can. "You've been quiet all morning," he said, his voice casual. "What's eating you this time?" Ethan straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Remember that ID I found yesterday? The trucker's badge?" "Yeah, the one Marlene said belonged to some missing guy?" Tyler raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "I can't stop thinking about it," Ethan admitted. "It feels like I stumbled onto something important. That man disappeared, Tyler. No trace for 30 years. What if this is the first clue anyone's found since then?" Tyler chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you've been watching too many crime shows. You really think you're going to solve some cold case just because you pulled junk out of the river?" Ethan bristled. "It's not junk. This badge belonged to a real person. A father, a husband. Don't you think his family deserves to know what happened to him?" Tyler studied him for a moment, his easy smile fading into something more serious. "Look, I get it. But sometimes things are better left alone. You go digging into the past, you're bound to stir up trouble. Besides, what good's it gonna do you? You've got enough to deal with, your bills, the shop, your own mess." The words stung because they were true. Ethan's life had been unraveling. The garage barely made enough to cover expenses. His girlfriend, Anna, had finally packed up her things and left after too many arguments about the future he couldn't promise. He often felt invisible, trapped in a town where nothing ever changed. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt alive with the possibility of chasing something that mattered. That night he sat alone at his kitchen table, the badge in front of him, a half-empty beer bottle sweating on the wood. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He imagined Jack Turner in 1989, climbing into his rig, headlights cutting through the darkness on some lonely stretch of highway. Did he know it would be his last drive? Did he ever suspect he wouldn't make it home? Ethan whispered to himself, almost like a vow. "I need to know what happened to you." He thought of Anna's parting words. "You don't care about anything. You're just drifting." For once he felt the opposite. The discovery had awakened something in him that refused to settle back into silence. The following morning he carried the badge in his pocket to the diner again, unable to resist the pull of conversation. Marlene refilled his coffee and gave him a knowing look. "Still thinking about Jack, huh?" "Yeah," Ethan admitted. "Feels like the river gave me a responsibility. I can't just ignore it." Marlene sighed, her eyes softening. "If you're serious, you might start with the library. Old newspapers, microfilm. Sometimes the past hides in print." Her suggestion lodged in his mind. He had no idea what he would find, or if he'd even have the patience for dusty archives. But it was a start, a path leading away from the stagnation that had defined him. As he walked home, crisp autumn leaves crunching underfoot, Ethan felt the badge pressing against his chest. Tyler's words of caution still echoed, but so did the emptiness of his own life. For once, the choice was clear. He would follow the trail of Jack Turner wherever it led. The library smelled of dust and yellowed paper, the kind of scent that spoke of decades stacked neatly into silence. Ethan hadn't set foot inside since high school, but now he found himself hunched over a reel of microfilm, the whir of the machine filling the quiet air. The black and white pages of the Dayton Daily News rolled past, until one headline caught his eye. "Local trucker missing. Family pleads for help." The article, dated November 1989, described Jack Turner, a 38-year-old truck driver last seen leaving a rest stop along Interstate 70. His rig had never been recovered, and the investigation had run cold after only a few weeks. Ethan leaned closer, studying the photo printed beside the story. It was the same face from the badge, eyes tired, smile polite, a man caught mid-life with no hint of the mystery to come. He scribbled notes in a battered notebook, his mind racing. Every sentence seemed to deepen the hole Jack had fallen into. There was mention of a wife, Linda, and a daughter named Rachel, only 10 years old at the time. They had begged for information, but none came. Later, as he walked across the town square, autumn leaves spinning in the wind, Ethan stopped at a bench where an elderly man in a faded sheriff's jacket sat feeding pigeons. The man was Harold Dixon, once a deputy during the very year Jack Turner vanished. "Excuse me," Ethan said, holding out the notebook. "Were you working here back in '89, the Turner case?" Harold squinted up at him, his face lined like cracked leather. "Lord, son, that was a lifetime ago. Why are you asking about Jack?" "I found his ID by the river," Ethan explained. I want to understand what happened." Harold's eyes lingered on him, weighing his sincerity. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Jack was a good man. Everyone liked him. Drove for a company out of Columbus. Hard-working, always smiling. Then one night, gone. No wreck, no trail. We searched highways, rivers, even talked to truck stops all the way to Kentucky. Nothing." "Do you think he just left?" Ethan asked carefully. Harold shook his head. "No. That man loved his little girl too much. Something happened out there, but we never had proof. After a while, people stopped asking. That's the way it goes. Time buries more than the earth does." Ethan thanked him, though the answer left him restless. He wandered to the old truck stop on the edge of town, now half empty and dimly lit. A waitress in her 60s, her hair pinned back with fading clips, poured him coffee as he asked about 1989. "Jack Turner," she repeated, her accent thick with Midwest twang. "Honey, I remember him. Stopped here almost every week. Nice man, tipped well. That night he disappeared. He came in for pie, same as always. Then he walked out to his rig, and that was it. He never came back." "Did anyone follow him? Notice anything strange?" Ethan pressed. She hesitated, biting her lip. "There was a fella sitting by the window that night, watching Jack real close. Some of the other truckers said he wasn't local. Big guy, wore a cap low over his face. But no one ever found him again." Her words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He could almost picture the scene, Jack finishing his pie, heading into the cool night, unaware that someone's eyes were on him. Walking back to town, Ethan turned the badge over in his pocket. He now knew Jack Turner wasn't just a name. He was a man remembered by those who'd crossed his path, a man whose sudden disappearance had left a hole no one dared to fill. The silence around him wasn't natural. It felt constructed, as if someone had wanted the world to forget. But Ethan couldn't forget. Not now. The badge had pulled him in, and the pieces of Jack's last night whispered louder with every step. Yet the more he uncovered, the more he sensed resistance pressing against the truth, like a door someone had nailed shut. And he was ready to push harder. The sheriff's office stood on the corner of Main Street, its brick walls weathered by decades of sun and rain. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, illuminating framed photos of past sheriffs on the walls. Ethan pushed the door open, clutching Jack Turner's badge in his jacket pocket, his heartbeat drumming faster with every step. Behind the desk sat Sheriff Collins, a man in his 50s with a sturdy build and sharp grey eyes. He looked up from a stack of paperwork as Ethan approached. "Morning," Collins said, his voice steady, clipped. "What can I do for you?" Ethan placed the badge on the counter carefully, the metal glinting under the harsh lights. "I found this in the river. Belongs to Jack Turner. He went missing in 1989. Collins picked up the badge, turning it between his fingers. His expression didn't change, but the silence stretched long. Finally, he set it down with a muted clink. "Yeah, I know the name. Cold case. Been that way for 30 years. I think this could be important," Ethan pressed. "It proves he, or at least something of his, ended up near the river. Doesn't that mean the case should be looked at again?" Collins leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Son, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you need to understand something. That case was worked hard. Your little discovery doesn't change much. A badge in a river after 3 decades could have been tossed there by anyone, any time." Frustration burned in Ethan's chest. But what if it wasn't? What if it's part of the truth people missed? Collins's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping into something firm, almost final. "You think you're the first person to want answers? Jack's family begged for them. We searched highways, dredged waters, interviewed everyone from here to Indiana. Nothing stuck. Sometimes cases don't close because there's nothing left to find. Reopening wounds only hurts the people who had to learn to live with it. Ethan's jaw tightened. He could hear the dismissal in every word, the subtle command to walk away. But the thought of Rachel Turner, a child who grew up without knowing why her father never came home, gnawed at him. "I can't just ignore it," Ethan said. "Someone has to care." Colin stood, his voice carrying authority now. "Listen, you found some old metal, fine, I'll log it, store it, and that'll be that. But don't go running around stirring people up with half-baked theories. Folks around here don't need ghost stories from the past dragging them down." The sharpness in the sheriff's tone made Ethan feel like a kid being scolded. Still, beneath the warning, he sensed something else, a flicker of unease, maybe even fear. Ethan forced a nod, though inside frustration churned hotter. "All right, do what you have to do." As he turned to leave, Collins called after him. "I'm serious, Miller. Let it go. This isn't your burden to carry." The words followed him out the door like a shadow. The cool air outside slapped against his face, but it didn't wash away the feeling in his gut. It wasn't just resistance. It was a wall being thrown up, brick by brick, to keep him out. Back at the garage, Ethan dropped onto a stool, his hands running through his hair. Tyler noticed the storm brewing in his expression. "Let me guess," Tyler said, leaning against the tool bench. "Sheriff shut you down?" "Completely," Ethan muttered. "He doesn't want it reopened. Acts like I'm causing trouble just for asking questions." "Maybe he's right," Tyler replied carefully. "Maybe you're chasing smoke." Ethan slammed his palm on the workbench, startling even himself. "No." "It feels real, Ty. That badge ended up in the river for a reason. Someone put it there, someone wanted it gone." Tyler studied him, silent for a moment. Then he shook his head. "Man, you've got that look in your eyes. The one where you're not going to stop, no matter what anyone says. Just don't get yourself buried in something too big." Ethan didn't answer. He stared at the rusted bolts scattered across the bench, but his mind was already racing ahead. If the sheriff wouldn't help, he'd have to keep digging on his own. The first door had been slammed shut, but that only made him more determined to find another way in. The Turner house sat on the outskirts of town, a modest single-story home with a sagging porch and wind chimes that clinked softly in the afternoon breeze. Ethan hesitated at the gate, badge in his pocket, nerves twisting in his stomach. He had debated all morning whether it was right to knock on this door, but something stronger than doubt had pushed him here. If anyone deserved to see the badge again, it was Jack Turner's family. He raised his hand and knocked. After a pause, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Her eyes, sharp but tired, studied him cautiously. "Rachel Turner?" Ethan asked. "Yes," she replied, suspicion in her tone. "Do I know you?" "My name's Ethan Miller. I found something that belongs to your father." Her hand tightened on the doorknob, and for a heartbeat she looked as though she might shut him out. But instead, she opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." The living room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. Photographs lined the mantel, some new, some faded with age. Ethan noticed one in particular, a younger Rachel, maybe 10 years old, standing beside a tall man in a trucker's cap. The man's smile was unmistakable. Ethan pulled the badge from his pocket and placed it carefully on the coffee table. Rachel froze. For a long time she didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared at the weathered photo of her father staring back at her from decades ago. Where did you get this?" Her voice cracked as she finally looked at him. "I was magnet fishing in the river last week," Ethan explained. "It came up on the line. I didn't know who it belonged to at first, but then I asked around. People remembered him." Rachel picked up the badge, her fingers trembling. "I haven't seen this since I was a kid. He wore it every day. Mom kept hoping it would turn up somewhere, but after she passed, she trailed off, swallowing hard." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I went to the sheriff with it. He doesn't want the case opened again. Told me to let it go." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "That sounds about right. They all told us to move on back then, too." My mum died never knowing what happened to him. Do you know how hard it is growing up wondering if your dad walked away from you, or if something worse happened? I don't think he walked away, Ethan said firmly. Everyone I've talked to said he was a good man. I think something happened that night. I think the truth got buried. Rachel set the badge down, rubbing her temples. Do you know how many people came around here in the first few years? Reporters, self-proclaimed investigators, even neighbors who thought they knew something. Every time it ended with nothing, just disappointment. I swore I wouldn't let myself get pulled into it again. I get that, Ethan admitted. But I can't ignore this. I don't know why, but it feels like I was meant to find it. Maybe because I don't have much else in my life right now. Maybe because it just doesn't sit right. But I think your dad deserves someone trying. Rachel studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring his sincerity. After a long silence, she walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a shoebox. Setting it on the table, she lifted the lid to reveal old photographs, receipts, and a journal worn from years of thumbing through it. My mum kept these, she said softly, every little thing connected to him. Sometimes I think she hoped one of us would figure it out someday. If you're serious, maybe these can help. Ethan's chest tightened. He hadn't expected trust, yet here it was, fragile but real. Thank you, he said. I promise I won't stop, not until I know what happened to him. Rachel's voice wavered, but determination flickered beneath her grief. Then maybe, just maybe, it's finally time someone tried again. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon pulled through time, cracked pavement, rusted signs, and faded memories etched into every mile. Ethan drove Jack Turner's last known route, following details Rachel had pieced together from her mother's notes and her own scattered memories. It began in Dayton, moved southeast through Springfield, and was meant to end near Knoxville. But somewhere along the line, Jack had vanished. Ethan passed aging truck stops, their neon signs half-lit even in daylight, and boarded up diners that had once served midnight coffee to men like Jack. He stopped at each place that still stood, asking the same questions, showing the same photograph. Most people shook their heads, some barely looked. A few offered vague recollections. At a rundown fuel stop just outside Chillicothe, an old man behind the register paused when Ethan showed him Jack's photo. Yeah, the man said, voice rasping like gravel. I remember him. Used to drive a red Kenworth, friendly guy, always tipped the girls good. Ethan leaned in. Do you remember the last time you saw him? The man frowned. Was a long time ago, but I think he was here that night he disappeared. Said he had a late delivery down near Oak Ridge. But that don't make sense. Company records said he was headed the other direction. Ethan blinked. Wait, you're sure? Pretty sure, the man muttered, scratching his chin. Truckers talk. That route south wasn't common unless they were hauling something off books. Some folks did. Not my business. That word, off books, hung in Ethan's mind as he drove on. The highways narrowed into rural stretches, lined with trees beginning to burn orange and gold. The deeper he went, the more the road felt like it was leading not just through space, but into something buried. In a dusty roadside diner near the Ohio-Kentucky border, he found a woman who used to wait tables back in the 80s. Her name was Carol, and she watched him carefully over the rim of her coffee cup. You're not the first to ask about Jack Turner, she said. Some reporter came through in the 90s, digging around, left empty-handed. Did he talk to you? Ethan asked. She nodded. Same questions. Same photo. I told him what I'll tell you. Jack wasn't the kind of man to just disappear, but there was something off that night. He seemed distracted, nervous, kept checking the windows like he was waiting for someone. Ethan's pulse quickened. Did he say anything? Mention anyone? Carol looked past him as if sifting through a memory that hadn't been touched in years. He said something strange. I remember it because it didn't make any sense. He said, if I don't show up tomorrow, it wasn't my choice. I thought he was joking, but the next day, he never came back. The words struck Ethan like a blow. A man doesn't say something like that unless he knows something is coming for him. Do you think someone was after him? Ethan asked. Carol hesitated, then nodded. Truckers back then got into all kinds of things. Smuggling, off-the-book shipments, private hauls no one asked questions about. Jack was clean. but maybe he got too close to someone who wasn't. Driving away from the diner, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that every stop brought him closer to a story no one wanted retold. The details didn't line up. Why would Jack say he was headed south when the company had him scheduled east? And why had no one asked these questions back then? He pulled over on a hill overlooking a long stretch of empty road. The sky was turning amber, casting long shadows across the fields. There was something rotten in Jack Turner's last route: misdirections, half-truths, and silence. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. The roads weren't just old, they were hiding something. And someone had worked hard to make sure that whatever happened that night stayed buried under decades of dust and asphalt. But now, the trail was warming. The truck stop outside Lexington had seen better days. The paint peeled from its sign. The parking lot was cracked and faded, but the smell of diesel still hung thick in the air. Ethan stepped out of his truck and looked around until he spotted the man he'd been told about, a wiry figure sitting at a corner picnic table, cigarette in hand, cap low over his eyes. Hank Delaney had driven rigs for 40 years before retirement. According to Carol, he and Jack Turner had shared routes more than once. Ethan approached cautiously. "You Hank Delaney?" The man glanced up, squinting through the smoke. "Who's asking?" "Ethan Miller. I've been looking into Jack Turner. I heard you knew him." Hank didn't respond at first. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaled, then nodded. "Yeah, I knew Jack. Hell of a driver. Good man." "Why are you digging up ghosts, son?" Ethan sat across from him. "Because I found Jack's ID badge in the river a week ago, and because nobody else seems to care what happened to him." The older man's brow furrowed. 30 years gone, and now his name pops up again. That ain't coincidence. "I've been retracing his route," Ethan said. "Something about that night doesn't add up." "People remember different directions, different moods." He told someone, "If I don't show up tomorrow, it wasn't my choice." Hank grunted. "That sounds like Jack. He had a gut for trouble. Knew when the wind was shifting." He stubbed out the cigarette. "We used to run routes together out of Columbus. Mid-80s were rough. You had companies cutting corners, hauling cargo that didn't always show up on paper. You kept your mouth shut, took your paycheck, went home. You think Jack was involved in that?" "No. But I think he saw something he shouldn't have." Hank's voice dropped. "There was a company, Gale Freight, shady as hell. Guys went missing or got warned off if they asked too many questions. Jack hauled for him once or twice, but he didn't like it. Said things didn't feel right." "Like what?" Ethan leaned forward. "Paperwork didn't match the load. Drivers were told not to stop at way stations. Once Jack said he saw a trailer being swapped in the dead of night. No lights, just 2 rigs out by an abandoned warehouse, south of Chillicothe. He didn't talk much about it after that." Ethan's mind reeled. "So you think he was silenced?" "I think he was scared. Jack wasn't paranoid, but he trusted his instincts. That week he vanished. He told me he was thinking of reporting something. Said he'd seen a name come up on a manifest that didn't belong there. I told him to walk away. He didn't listen." "What name?" Hank shook his head. "He never said, just that it was someone with power, someone who could make things disappear." Ethan sat back, the cool breeze brushing against his neck. "Why didn't anyone follow up back then?" "Because folks like me didn't want to end up like Jack, and because Gale Freight had friends in high places. Money, connections, hell, some of those guys played golf with county sheriffs." The story died before it could breathe. Silence fell between them, heavy and long. Then Hank stood, bones creaking. "You keep pushing this, they'll notice, just like they noticed him. Be careful, kid." "I can't stop now," Ethan said quietly. "Not after everything I've found." Hank gave a slow nod. "Then don't do it alone. People will tell you to drop it, make you feel like you're crazy." "But Jack wasn't crazy, and neither are you." As Ethan walked back to his truck, he looked out over the empty lot, where rigs used to rumble through night after night. Now it sat still, but the echoes of stories long buried whispered in the air. He wasn't chasing a ghost. He was chasing the silence that swallowed one, and it was time to make it speak. The road to the warehouse was narrow and cracked, bordered by weeds and rusting fence posts. Ethan followed the directions Hank had scribbled on a napkin, the words barely legible but laced with urgency. South of Chillicothe, he'd written. Abandoned since the early 90s. Jack said they swapped trailers there. As Ethan approached, the sky had turned a slate gray and a chill settled over the empty fields. The structure stood alone, massive, forgotten, its roof sagging like a beast that had lain down to die. Corrugated metal walls were streaked with rust, and one of the loading dock doors hung half open, groaning softly in the wind. Ethan parked his truck off the road, heart thudding with unease. The air smelled like mildew and old oil. Every instinct in him told him to turn around, but he couldn't. Inside, the warehouse was vast and hollow. His footsteps echoed across the concrete floor as he moved between stacks of broken pallets and overturned crates. Light filtered through broken windows in jagged slivers. Cobwebs stretched between steel beams above. He passed a corner office with shattered glass on the floor and the remains of a filing cabinet lying open. He rifled through what was left, but the papers were rotted beyond recognition. Still, the silence around him buzzed with tension, like the building held its breath. As he walked deeper into the shadows, something metallic caught his eye beneath a pile of old tarps. He knelt, tugged the fabric away, and uncovered a mangled piece of metal. It was curved, thin, and painted red, faded almost to brown. A corner of it still showed the remnants of white lettering. Kenworth. His breath caught. It was part of a truck mirror. Ethan turned it over and spotted the edge of a serial plate, rusted but barely readable. His hands trembled as he took a photo, the weight of the discovery crashing into him. If this belonged to Jack's truck, it was the first physical trace in 3 decades. Suddenly, the creak of wood echoed behind him. Ethan froze. He turned slowly, scanning the shadows. No one. Just the wind whispering through gaps in the roof. He stood and backed toward the dock, adrenaline flooding his veins. Whether it was paranoia or someone actually watching, he couldn't tell. But he'd learned enough to know that uncovering secrets people wanted buried never came without danger. Once outside, he took a few more photos of the area, documenting everything. The tire tracks in dried mud, the burn marks on a metal drum, even the odd scrap of yellow fabric tangled on a chain-link fence. Every detail could matter. Back in his truck, he sat gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the warehouse. He called Rachel. "I found something," he said. Her voice came through with quiet urgency. "What is it?" "A mirror. Red. Kenworth branding. It could be Jack's. I found it in a warehouse Hank told me about." Rachel was silent for a moment. Then she whispered, "I don't know if I should be hopeful or terrified." "Both, probably," Ethan said. "But this is real, Rachel. I'm not just chasing smoke anymore." "I want to see it," she said. "Take me there." "I will," Ethan promised. "But first I need to figure out who owned this place, who used it, and who made sure no one ever came looking here." As he drove away, he kept checking his rearview mirror. There was no one behind him, but his nerves stayed taut. Something had shifted. He wasn't just stumbling into a mystery anymore, he was walking straight into its heart. And whatever waited in the next layer of truth, it didn't want to be found. The garage was dim when Ethan returned late that night, the overhead lights buzzing faintly, casting shadows across the concrete floor. He locked the door behind him, tension curling in his chest like a storm gathering. The warehouse, the mirror, the way the wind had felt colder than it should have, none of it sat right. He left the photos and notes on his desk, then carefully placed Jack Turner's badge in the drawer beneath, wrapping it in a rag. He didn't sleep well, and when he finally drifted off on the cot in the back room, it was with the distinct feeling that he wasn't alone. The sound of shattered glass jolted him awake. He shot up, heart racing. The front window had been broken, glass in sharp shards scattered across the floor. His desk had been rifled through, papers tossed like confetti, and the drawer where the badge had been, empty. Panic surged. He tore through the shop searching, but it was gone. Someone had been here, someone knew. He called Tyler. "Someone broke into the garage," Ethan said, breath shallow. "They took Jack's badge." "Wait, what?" Tyler's voice was groggy, confused. What do you mean they took it? I mean someone knew I had it. Someone didn't want me to keep it. Tyler was quiet for a long beat. Ethan, maybe this has gone far enough. You said it yourself, this stuff doesn't feel right, maybe it's time to back off. Ethan laughed bitterly. Back off? After everything I've found? After talking to Rachel? After that warehouse? I get it, man, I really do, Tyler said. But you're not a cop. You're not a reporter. You're just you. And you're in way over your head. I can't stop now, Ethan snapped. Not when people are trying to shut me up. That's exactly why I have to keep going. You really think whoever broke in just wanted the badge? I think they wanted to send a message. Later that day, Ethan met Rachel at the coffee shop. Her eyes widened when he told her about the break-in. They took the badge? She asked, voice tense. Gone, Ethan said, but they didn't find the photos. I've got everything else saved digitally. But this means someone's watching. Rachel leaned forward, her voice low. We need to be careful. If someone was willing to go into your shop, they might be willing to do more. Ethan nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. I didn't think it would get this real. But it is. Hank warned me. People with power don't like being exposed. She pulled a worn envelope from her purse and handed it to him. These are some of the old manifests my mom kept. I didn't want to give them to you until I was sure. But now, if they're trying to scare us, we need to push back. He flipped through the pages, logistics, dates, driver initials. One stood out. Look at this, Ethan said. This delivery, October 27th, 1989. That's the night Jack disappeared. But the destination's blacked out. Why would they redact a delivery address from a 30-year-old manifest? Because it wasn't supposed to exist, Rachel whispered. Whatever he saw that night, it started with that delivery. Back at the garage, Ethan installed a new lock. The broken glass had been swept up, but the feeling remained. A violation, a warning. Tyler stopped by later that evening, arms crossed, eyes scanning the damaged door. This is serious now, he muttered. You sure you want to keep going? Ethan met his gaze, steady. I'm not just sure, I'm certain. They're hiding something. And they're scared I'll find it. Tyler sighed, then finally said, Then you're not doing it alone, I've got your back. For the first time in days, Ethan felt like the ground beneath him was solid. He wasn't chasing shadows anymore. Now, he was fighting the silence. The light above Ethan's workbench flickered as he laid out Rachel's documents beside his own notes. Names, dates, companies, addresses, years of forgotten logistics. Tyler stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as they both stared at the puzzle. Okay, Ethan said, tapping the manifest from October 27th, 1989. This was Jack's last known haul, but the destination's blacked out and the freight description is vague. Materials. Nothing more. Who shipped it? Tyler asked. Ethan scanned the faded ink. Originating company Gale Freight. Tyler muttered a curse under his breath. Same company Hank mentioned. And wasn't that the one with missing records? Ethan nodded. And look, this delivery was logged under a secondary dispatch code. That wasn't protocol back then unless the job was off the books. Rachel leaned over the table, brow furrowed. So Jack was assigned a shipment that didn't officially exist, with a delivery point no one once traced. That's not bad bookkeeping. That's deliberate. Ethan flipped to another sheet. Here's what gets me. The next day, a shipment with the same weight was logged by a different driver. Same company, same freight type. But this time the address is clear, an industrial site outside Knoxville. What if Jack never made that delivery because someone else did, after making him disappear? Tyler stared at the paper. So either they rerouted the cargo, or Jack saw something during pickup they didn't want him to talk about. Rachel crossed her arms tightly. My father always followed the rules. If something smelled wrong, he wouldn't just go along with it. Maybe he confronted someone. Maybe that's why he never came home. Ethan swallowed hard. We need to find out who signed off on these hauls. There's a name here, M. Kessler. The signature appears 3 times, always on unusual shipments. He might be the link. Google? Tyler offered. They ran the name through databases and news archives. Eventually, a hit surfaced. Martin Kessler, former logistics coordinator for Gale Freight. Left the company in 1991 after a federal investigation into transport violations, never charged. Disappeared from the public record after that. Rachel's eyes locked on Ethan's. That's him. He knew something. Or did something. Too many coincidences, Ethan murmured. The warehouse. The altered manifests. The badge showing up now. Someone's getting nervous. They wanted this forgotten. Tyler sat down, the weight of it sinking in. This is bigger than a missing trucker. This was an organized operation. Jack stumbled onto it, and they made sure he wouldn't talk. The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind rattled the garage doors. Ethan felt the silence pressing in like a tide. I need to talk to the sheriff again, he said finally. Not to ask this time, to show him what we've got. Rachel frowned. He already told you to back off. He did, Ethan agreed. But this time, I'm not walking in empty-handed. He copied the manifests, highlighted the inconsistencies, printed out Kessler's records. As he organized the folder, something shifted inside him. No longer the drifting mechanic poking around in old stories. Now he was driven by proof, by the steady drumbeat of truth emerging through layers of silence. Tyler clapped him on the shoulder. You're really doing this. Ethan looked up. No, we are. This isn't just about Jack anymore. It's about how easy it is to erase someone when the wrong people have power. We can't let them win again. Rachel nodded, voice quiet but resolute. For 30 years, my family lived in the shadow of a question. If we can bring the truth into the light, maybe that shadow ends. Ethan picked up the folder, heart pounding. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, he had something solid. A story that wasn't just a hunch, but a thread connected to real people, real lies. And if they were right, pulling that thread could unravel everything. The river looked different now. Darker. Heavier. The same place where Ethan had first pulled the badge from the water now felt like a gateway. Not to something forgotten, but to something long buried that was slowly forcing its way back into the world. The air hung thick with moisture, the grey sky pressing low. Rachel stood beside him on the muddy bank, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Tyler was a few feet away, pulling the heavy-duty magnet from the back of Ethan's truck. None of them spoke as they prepared. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent, like they were standing on sacred ground. Ethan tied the magnet to the rope and looked out across the slow-moving current. This is where it started, he said quietly. Maybe it's where it ends too. Rachel nodded. Do you remember exactly where you found the badge? Yeah, right about there. He pointed to a bend near the rocks where the current swirled. They began to drag the magnet slowly through the water, methodically, the rope tightening with each cast, then coiling back in with clumps of river debris. Nails, cans, twisted rebar. Nothing meaningful. Hours passed. The cold bit into their hands and feet. Still, they kept searching. Then, on one pull, the rope came up heavier than before. Tyler grunted, bracing his feet as he dragged the weight toward them. Rachel stepped closer. Something emerged from the river's edge. A large, corroded metal object coated in mud and algae. Ethan knelt down and began clearing it with gloved hands. His breath caught. It was a side mirror, red, broken, with a faint outline of a logo nearly obscured by rust. But there was no mistaking it. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand. It's his truck, she whispered. It's part of his truck. They kept searching and found more. A section of bent metal with red paint still clinging to the edge, a chunk of a headlamp, fragments of what looked like a dashboard panel. Ethan's heart pounded as he laid them out one by one. Someone tried to make this disappear. They didn't count on time giving it back. Tyler looked out over the water. If the truck's in there, the rest of it might still be intact, maybe even the cab. Rachel turned to Ethan. Her voice shook. If it's still there, and if he's still inside. Ethan's throat tightened. He couldn't say the words, but he knew what she meant. That night, back at the garage, Ethan couldn't sleep. The weight of what they'd found sat on his chest like an anchor. He kept seeing Rachel's face when she touched the mirror, the way her fingers trembled. He pulled out his phone and opened a message thread with Sheriff Collins. His thumb hovered. Then he typed, "We found parts of Jack Turner's truck in the river. You need to see it." He hit send. The reply came 30 minutes later. "Where?" Ethan sent the coordinates. Then, after a pause, he added, "There's more. I think the whole truck is still down there." There was no answer for a long time. Just as he was about to shut off the phone, it buzzed again. "Be there in the morning. Don't touch anything else." The next morning came with fog hanging low over the river. As they stood waiting, Ethan looked at Rachel. "You okay?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not really, but I need this, even if it hurts." He understood. The truth always came with pain, but it was still better than silence. In the distance, the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the stillness. Ethan didn't know what the sheriff would do next, or what the next discovery might cost them, but for the first time, the river was starting to give up its secrets, and somewhere in the cold water, the truth about Jack Turner waited to be pulled free. Sheriff Collins didn't say much when he arrived. He stood on the riverbank, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the twisted pieces of metal Ethan and Rachel had lined up like relics. His deputy snapped photos, while Collins paced in silence, jaw clenched tight. After several minutes, he finally spoke. "You're telling me this stuff came out of the river just upstream?" Ethan nodded. "We used a magnet again. Same spot I found the badge." "There's more down there. We didn't touch anything else." Collins let out a slow breath. "I'll call a dive team, but you need to stay clear of this now. Understand?" Rachel stepped forward. "You said that last time. And look where we are. My father's truck has been sitting in that river for 30 years and nobody ever found it." "Why?" The sheriff looked at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Because nobody was looking in the right place. Maybe because we weren't given the right reasons to." Ethan didn't buy it. "Or maybe because someone didn't want it found." Collins didn't answer. He turned and walked back to his cruiser, speaking into his radio. That night, Ethan, Rachel, and Tyler sat in the garage again. The silence between them was heavier than usual. "Do you think he'll actually follow through?" Tyler asked. Ethan shrugged. "He called the dive team. That's something." Rachel shook her head. "It's not enough. There's still no justice. No one's asking the real questions. Who was behind it and why they got away with it?" "I've been thinking about that," Ethan said, reaching for the folder with the documents. "There's one more piece I haven't followed up on." He pulled out a copy of the freight log signed by M. Kessler and a faded business card from Gale Freight. "I want to talk to whoever's still alive from that company," he said. "If I can find Kessler or anyone else who knew him, we might finally get the full picture." Tyler frowned. "That's not just digging anymore. That's poking the hornet's nest." "I know." Ethan met his eyes. "But they already broke into the shop, took the badge, tried to scare us off." "I'm not backing down now." The next morning, Ethan made calls. He tracked down Gale Freight's last listed office, now a storage unit business, and spoke to a retired dispatcher who used to work under Kessler. The man, reluctant at first, eventually agreed to meet in a small diner off I-75. His name was Al Jenkins. 69, hunched with sun-leathered skin and hands that trembled slightly as he stirred his coffee. "You're not the first to come asking about Jack Turner," Al said, "but most people gave up before they got too close. Kessler didn't play games. He had people behind him. Government contracts, law enforcement friends. If he wanted something buried, it stayed buried." Ethan leaned forward. "Did he have anything to do with Jack's disappearance?" Al hesitated. "All I know is that Jack was worried. He'd started asking questions about shipments that didn't match, about trailers switching hands in the middle of the night. Kessler didn't like that. One day Jack's name vanished from the board. Never showed up again. Do you think Kessler had him killed?" "I think Jack saw something he wasn't supposed to, and I think Kessler made a call. After that, everything went quiet." Ethan's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "Why didn't you come forward?" Al looked away. "Because I have a family. Because I—" And back then people disappeared for asking less than that. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken. Ethan stepped out of the diner, feeling the weight of a world he hadn't known existed just weeks before. He wasn't chasing conspiracy anymore. He was chasing men, real, flawed, dangerous men, who had names, faces, and a long trail of silence behind them. And someone among them had made Jack Turner vanish. The dive team arrived just after sunrise. 3 trucks, 2 boats, and a group of men in dry suits moved like clockwork along the muddy riverbank. Sheriff Collins stood nearby with arms crossed, eyes guarded. Rachel kept her distance, silent, watching every move as if her entire life were about to change. Ethan stood beside her, heart pounding. It had all led to this moment. Every question, every lie uncovered, every step closer to the truth. By mid-morning, the divers surfaced with confirmation. "There's a cab down there," one said. "Rusted out, buried deep, but it's there." A murmur rippled through the team. Collins knelt beside one of the recovered items, a gear shift panel with a VIN number etched into the metal. He handed it off to his deputy. "Run it," he ordered. 30 minutes later, the result came back. Match confirmed. It's Turner's truck. Rachel's knees buckled, and Ethan caught her before she hit the ground. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "He didn't leave, he never left." As the divers continued their work, Ethan stepped aside and opened his phone. There was one last thing he hadn't followed through on, a local records request he had filed days ago with the sheriff's office archives. Earlier that morning, he'd received a message saying they had found a missing folder. Now, in the shade of a poplar tree, he opened the PDF and began to read. The report was dated November 2nd, 1989. It had been written by a young officer, now long retired, who had responded to a disturbance at a rest stop just outside Chillicothe. The report described a parked red Kenworth and a man matching Jack Turner's description, arguing with another individual in a dark sedan. The officer had approached the scene, but before he could intervene, the sedan sped off. The officer followed, leaving the truck unattended. When he returned hours later, both the truck and the driver were gone. The case was never followed up. The officer's notes ended with a single line. "Suspect may be involved with Gale Freight, unconfirmed." The document had been marked filed in error. Ethan stared at the words, rage simmering beneath his skin. This wasn't just neglect. It was erasure. Someone had deliberately buried that report. He stormed back to Collins. "Did you know about this?" The sheriff took the phone, scanned the report, and his expression hardened. "No, I didn't. Someone in your department filed this away on purpose. Jack's truck was seen after he disappeared. An officer saw him arguing with someone, and no one followed up." Collins looked shaken. "I was a rookie then. This never crossed my desk." Rachel stepped forward. "Then who buried it?" Collins didn't answer. He stared at the river, eyes distant. Later that day, with more pieces of the truck recovered, a diver came up holding something wrapped in cloth. Inside it, rusted but identifiable, were remains, bone fragments, a wallet, and a wedding band. Rachel clutched the ring in her palm. "That's his," she said, voice breaking for the first time. "That's my dad's." Ethan watched her, throat tight. The badge had been the beginning, but this was the truth. Final. Irreversible. They had found Jack Turner. The pieces were clear now. Jack had discovered something illegal, a shipment that didn't match, a name that didn't belong. He'd tried to act. Maybe he'd threatened to report it, and someone from Gale Freight had made sure he never got the chance. The argument, the disappearance, the buried police report, it had all been part of a pattern designed to protect the powerful, but not anymore. Ethan stood beside Rachel, the river behind them now quiet. "This isn't over," he said. "But we've started something they can't silence again." She nodded, gripping the ring so tightly her knuckles turned white. "He mattered," she whispered, "and now the world knows it." The small courtroom smelled like old paper and tension. Ethan sat quietly near the back, watching as Rachel stood near the front, flanked by her lawyer. Across the aisle, a man in a grey suit stared straight ahead, shoulders stiff, face expressionless. His name was Leonard Price, a former executive from Gale Freight. He wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, if there ever was one, But evidence had finally tied him to the false manifests, the ghost deliveries, and most importantly, the illegal operation Jack Turner had tried to expose. This wasn't a murder trial. There were no charges for that, not yet. Too much time had passed and no direct link could be proven. But there were federal charges now: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and falsifying interstate commerce records. And this was just the beginning. Rachel gripped the small gold ring in her hand as she gave her statement. Her voice was steady, but the emotion pulsed underneath every word. "My father didn't disappear," she said. "He was erased because he cared enough to speak up, because he did what was right. And for 30 years, he was treated like a rumor, but he was a man, a father. And now finally the silence around his name has ended." Ethan watched her with pride. She had walked through fire to get here. They both had. Outside, the press waited, not in swarms, but enough to notice. The story had spread, local news, then regional. Truck driver's disappearance, solved after 30 years. Evidence pulled from Ohio River. Later, at the edge of the same river that had once hidden Jack's truck, Rachel and Ethan stood together. A memorial had been placed there, a simple stone plaque with Jack Turner's name, his photo, and the words, "He stood for truth. We will not forget." The wind rippled through the trees. The water moved steadily, no longer ominous, but peaceful, like it had finally let go of its secrets. Ethan stared at the river, hands in his pockets. "They're going to keep digging, you know." "More names are going to come out." Rachel nodded. "Good. Let every single one face what they tried to bury." "You okay?" She looked down at the ring, then out over the water. "I think I finally will be." He stayed beside her in the quiet, letting the breeze carry the weight of years away. A few days later, Ethan returned to the garage. The repairs from the break-in had been finished. The space looked the same, but he didn't feel the same walking through it. Tyler was under a car when Ethan walked in. "So, hero of the decade," he called out, grinning. "Back to turning wrenches with the rest of us?" Ethan chuckled. "Just for a while. But things are different now." "Yeah," Tyler said, sitting up. "You look different too. Like you actually did something that mattered." "I did," Ethan replied, "but I didn't do it alone." Rachel stopped by that afternoon with a small box. Inside was Jack's wallet, recovered from the cab, dried, fragile but intact. She handed it to Ethan. "You were the one who started this. You deserve to see it." He opened it gently, and inside was a folded photo of a 10-year-old Rachel with Jack standing beside his truck, both smiling. "Thank you," Ethan said softly. Rachel smiled through a shimmer of tears. "You gave him back to me. You gave me back to me." The days passed and life in town returned to its rhythms. But something had shifted. Jack Turner was no longer a question. He was a story, a true one. And Ethan Miller, once just a drifting mechanic, had become the man who helped tell it. It was early fall again, just like the day Ethan had first cast his magnet into the river. The leaves had started to change, dotting the streets with red and gold, and the air carried that crisp bite that signaled the season's turn. Ethan walked along the riverbank alone this time, the current slow and reflective, sunlight glittering off its surface. He stopped near the place where it had all begun, where Jack Turner's ID badge had risen from the depths and demanded not to be forgotten. A year had passed since that moment. Since then, the case had officially been closed. New investigations launched into Gale Freight's past, and more people had come forward. Drivers, dispatchers, even law enforcement officers who had once looked the other way. Jack Turner's name now stood for something. Ethan crouched down near the edge and tossed a small rock into the water. The ripples spread slowly outward, gentle but persistent. Rachel had moved out of state with her son, choosing a fresh start after decades of questions. She still called once a week. They didn't always talk about Jack. Sometimes they just shared silence, which now held more meaning than words. The town had changed in quiet ways too. People looked at Ethan differently. Not as the drifting mechanic without a plan, but as someone who had followed something through when no one else would. Tyler had repainted the garage and hung a framed copy of the article from the local paper on the wall. Truth in the Water, one man's fight to uncover a 30-year mystery. It wasn't about recognition, it never had been. But seeing that headline reminded Ethan of what mattered, of why he'd done it. Sometimes late at night he thought about Jack's last drive. The long stretches of highway, the sound of tires humming under stars, the quiet resolve of a man who chose honesty, even knowing it might cost him everything. He imagined Jack pulling into that rest stop, alone but unafraid. Now Ethan carried a piece of that resolve with him. As he stood and turned toward home, he smiled slightly. Not everything had an answer, but sometimes the truth was enough. If you've stayed with this story until now, thank you. And if this journey moved you, if Jack Turner's memory meant something more than just a name in a headline, take a moment to subscribe. These are the stories that deserve to be told, and we're not done yet. There's more waiting just beneath the surface. So go ahead, click the next video that's right here on your screen. Another true story is waiting, and this time, it might just change what you believe about what we leave behind.